All right, George Bagby, welcome to the Jay Burden Show. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. It's wonderful to be back.
I know I'm happy to have you. You're fresh off an appearance on Pete's show. It was very good. I highly recommend that the listeners go check that out. But what would you like to discuss today?
Well, we had been talking about doing a series of presentations on American folkways, and this is a very fruitful subject. This is famously the subject of David Hackett Fisher's book, Albion's Seed, which won some prestigious prizes back in the day. Um, I forget exactly when it was published, but it's a big brick of a book. And what he does is he covers four um, four periods of settlement from different groups from the British Isles. So he talks about the Scotch Irish, the Quakers in Pennsylvania, the Cavalier culture of colonial Virginia, and the Puritans of Massachusetts. So we're starting out with the Puritans. I've been spending a lot of time working with the Puritans lately, refreshing a lot of my knowledge on the subject and trying to expand it. I'm getting ready to speak to various audiences about the Puritans. It's something I'm going to be doing a lot of in the next couple of months. So it's a good opportunity to come on and start this series and talk about these curious people.
So, what is
So
the genesis of this culture? When did it start?
so we're talking about the early 1600s, and we're talking about the English Reformation and the factions that formed during the English Reformation. So we might you might remember something about the reign of Henry VIII, how he starts out as the famous defender of the faith. He writes a defense of Catholic doctrines against Martin Luther, actually, and wins the famous title Defender of the Faith from the Pope, but ends up embracing some reforming ideas himself, maybe for ulterior motives. I'm not getting into that. But what comes after Henry VIII and his daughter Elizabeth I, we see a period of radicalism in Protestant circles in England. And they all revolve around a vital question. And this is a question that is very much with all of us today. It doesn't matter what our faith might be. You can be a low church Baptist or a radical reformer of any stripe, or you could be a pagan. Your question is, what kind of attitude do we have towards our inheritance? And this is the basic question of all of these radical groups that were in conflict with one another. They weren't friends with one another, and they had something in common together, that they were against the established order to greater or lesser degree. So the Puritans are one of these groups. We're going to talk about a couple of these factions in particular because they came to America. But the 17th century reformers sees the levelers, who are a popular group. They believed in universal suffrage, which is a common enough idea. Universal manhood suffrage. They weren't talking about women's suffrage. But this reflects their ideas of church government. So they believed in the rule of the congregation and not the rule of the clergy. So in a very simple way, they're repudiating bishops, and they're also repudiating monarchy, because we see that those institutions are parallels and mirrors of each other. So they are Republicans. They're called levelers. You also have the Diggers, who split from the levelers. The Diggers were also believers in Republican government, representative government, did not like monarchy and were in conflict with the king. Were very enthusiastic participants in the English Civil War. Um, if you know your English history, you know that's going on in the 17th century. So they are partisans in that conflict. The Diggers were communists. They they wanted to recreate the society that you see in the book of Acts, where it discusses how the primitive Christians acted and that they had their property in common. The the scripture says they had all things in common. So the Diggers are embracing something like that, kind of experimenting with that, and they're radical agrarians. So they think that everyone should be farmers, and they are in conflict primarily with people in the cities. And then there's another group. They're called the Ranters, and we see a group of these in early Reformation Germany. There's a group of antinomians um, who say that Christians cannot sin, so they indulge in all sorts of sexual degeneracy, among other things. So that's an these are interesting people. There's some good works about the radicalism in these Reformation groups, and the various ways that they differed from each other in behavior and belief. But that's all good to keep in mind, that they're all radical Republicans. They all have problems with the king, with the clergy. They're splitting off from that. And the one thing that all of these groups have in common is they say that the Reformation needs to be about reinventing all of human society as you know it. So we see that something that they all have in common to greater or lesser degree is they do not like the traditions they've inherited from England. This is a very important point. They struggle to relate to their people's inheritance, and they take very radical measures to disassociate from that and to innovate. Very conscientiously, they want to innovate a new way of living, even to the degree that they're experimenting with abolishing the family. That's really wild. That's what the Ranters were doing, um, very unsuccessfully. But nevertheless, we see just how radical this is. So this all leads ultimately to some of these factions leaving England. So very famously, the um, the what were they called? They were called the Leiden separatists, I think is what they were called. We call them the separatists or the pilgrims. They they first go over to Holland. They are radical Calvinists. So they go over to Holland for a time, but then they realize that to live in Holland and raise your children in Holland means that your children grow up to be Dutch. And they thought that the Dutch were too worldly. It's really amusing. A leader of the separatists, uh, a really dynamic fellow, an American hero, um, a great founder of early colonial America, William Brewster, who was the minister of this faction. He writes about this in his book of Plymouth Plantation, and he says that they did their best to reform the Dutch people, but after a number of years, they judged their efforts a waste. So I thought that was extremely funny in some way. These folks, wherever they go, they're trying to reform other people. So I don't know if that involved trying to get them to speak English or something. But anyway, they weren't doing well in Holland. They thought that the Dutch, which are a great seafaring people, a great merchant people, people with connections all over the world, they thought that these people were too worldly, and it seems to me everyone would be too worldly for this group. Um, they they thought that it was impossible to remain connected to the Church of England at all, because the Church of England was too Catholic. So we see these are radical rejectors of tradition. We could say that they're after fundamentals of the faith, but they're in a position where their beliefs have required them to reinvent how to live as Christians, and even to reinvent the political order that they will live under. They won't live under the Dutch. They're just too foreign and too worldly. They do not want to live in England, and this is something very praiseworthy about them. Whatever faults we might identify with them these days, I think that it's important to identify winsome attributes and to try to be constructive about the people that we study. They were willing to make incredible sacrifices for their children to grow up in the environment that they thought was proper and right. Now, what's wild about them is that they had to invent that environment from scratch. The environment that they imagined did not exist in the world. And that was one of the reasons they decided to go to Massachusetts. So in 1620, these were the people on the Mayflower, or about half of them, a little more than half of the uh, voyagers on the Mayflower, the famous Mayflower in 1620, were these separatists, and they came over and landed in Massachusetts in December of 1620, which is a very bad time of year to start a colony in New England, right when winter is getting started. But they did it, and it did survive the winter, though I think most of them died. And half of them were these separatist families. So they believed that the Church of England was completely corrupt, and they did not want to have any part of English institutions. They wanted to reinvent things from scratch. And they famously crafted the Mayflower Compact, which is a democratic document, a Republican document, which we would expect from a group like this. They wanted to be sure that they established the terms on which they would carry on governance in the New World, partly because they didn't actually go to the Virginia colony like they had planned to. They ended up going too far north by mistake, rather. I think the currents were bad and dangerous. The winter was there. They had left England late in the year as it was, and so they needed to put ashore, and they ended up in Massachusetts Bay, and that was not their intention. So they needed some kind of supplemental governing document because they were not in touch with the governor of Virginia, and so they came up with the Mayflower Compact, the first English Republican document written in the Americas. And that secured the primacy of the separatists in that colony because they did outnumber the regular Anglicans that had come with the boat. So there were a number of them that were adherents of the Church of England, just regular English people out for the adventure. But the separatists made sure that they would be in charge of things when they landed. So because there were simply more of them. They are not the most important cultural force in early Massachusetts. They are one of two groups in Massachusetts. 10 years later, the Arabella arrives in Massachusetts Bay, and John Winthrop lands with his Puritans and founds the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Now, what's interesting about this is that John Winthrop has his own royal charter for the Puritans. The separatists down at Plymouth, that's where they step ashore. According to legend, they step ashore at Plymouth Rock, which is still there and you can still visit it. Plymouth is a town just a very short distance south of Boston. They had their own colony. That was the Plymouth colony. And then you had the Massachusetts Bay Colony, founded at Boston, just slightly north. So originally, they were two different colonies under two different governments. But up there, you have the Puritan settlement. Now, there were always far, far more Puritans than separatists, or for that matter, for many more Puritans than diggers or ranters or anything. Puritans are still technically members of the Church of England. John Winthrop lands at Massachusetts, and he says, well, here we will truly purify English institutions. And he says that Massachusetts will be the shining city on the hill, an example to the whole world, and he encourages his people when they're just assembling after arriving in Massachusetts on the Arabella. He tells them that we must try very, very hard to succeed here. If we fail, the entire world is watching us and they will condemn us for our failure. So we must be very diligent and dedicated. And that is where the phrase city on a hill comes from. So the Puritans, far more numerous and far more important as far as setting the character of the place, they land. And these people believe that salvation is a very intellectual, mentally engaged individual experience. Something that won't be a foreign idea to a great many of our Protestant friends. I was raised Baptist, and that was certainly part of the story that we told ourselves as Baptists, that we all had to have an individual experience that marked the moment in which we became Christians. Now, what went with that was things like believers' baptism, with the Baptists, famously. But the Puritans, they wanted an individual testimony from every member of their church about a salvation experience in order to be members of the church. Now, if you know anything about the Episcopal Church or Anglican groups or something, you know that's not how things work in those groups. Those groups practice the baptism of infants. So we have there a really interesting comparison to make. The Puritans do practice what some of us would call sacraments. Okay, so they practice ordinances of the church, is what we called them as Baptists, things like the Lord's Supper and baptism. However, they're thinking of those things very, very differently than their Church of England brethren. So, in the Church of England, you take your child when it is born and you baptize your child, and you proclaim your child's Christian name at his baptism. You give him the name that Christians have, and that is the moment in which your child is a baptized Christian. And though Christians will disagree about just when they will recognize the fact of their inheritance, that they're baptized even before they can remember, they might admit them to communion at different times and such. It's recognizing the efficacy of the ritual. The ritual actually changes people. All right? The ritual accomplishes a divine work in that person's soul and body, whether or not they are with it, whether or not they understand what's going on. And the more mystical approach is that not even the adult that reads theology for a living really understands what's going on ultimately. It's like there's something very mystical and mysterious about it ultimately that human beings can't understand. But the idea is that the ritual does something to people. So you can take someone before his baptism and he is not a Christian, and then after his baptism he is one. And the baptism accomplishes the fact, not anything he says or does. The Puritans did not believe that. And that puts them at odds with their Episcopalian or Church of England brethren. So that's a really interesting note to the side. I know that's kind of theological and involved, but the Puritans emphasized the intellectual. That is part of the heritage of Massachusetts. And we'll talk about how that develops. Obviously, if we know much about Massachusetts at all, we do know that they're very famous for their universities, in particular Harvard, right? And there's a reason why they were set up so early, why Harvard is the oldest school in the Americas, earliest European school, European founded school. Because it was set up for the education of the clergy, and also because the Puritans put so much stock in education. They believed that salvation itself was the product of thought and reflection. So they believed, like John Locke, the Republican theorist and sometime ally of these people, they believed that man was a product of experience, that the individual is a product of his experiences. And so they put an awful lot of stock into those Christian experiences. They wanted to have testimony about that. So even in Puritan New England, there was a strange number of people that were not technically members of their churches because they had not given testimony about a powerful spiritual experience that made them a Christian. And they did not believe that Christians could inherit this status through baptism, their parents having them baptized. Um, the clergy of these churches were called by the congregation. They were not sent by a higher official. The clergy were sanctified by the calling of the congregation. They were not set apart by ritual, a ritual of ordination, which made them a clergyman. So it's from the idea was that it was from the bottom up and not from the top down. This is similar to their idea of government, that the people would participate and they would have a republic. They were also Calvinists. Now, I'm not going to dwell on this, but they take exception to a number of things in Calvin. So they're Calvinists and Calvinists. Just because someone is a Calvinist does not mean that they are a Puritan from old Massachusetts. So one of the ways these peculiar beliefs manifested themselves, and in a really stunning way that they manifested themselves, was in the kinds of names that they gave to their children. So these are really curious. Now, most Puritans did not have the unusual Puritan names. Most of them were named Bible names. So they liked to name their daughters Mary and Rachel and Elizabeth and such, and they liked to name their sons after Old Testament figures frequently. That was something that made them kind of stand out in the England of their day. A regular Englishman would name his son Richard and Edward and George and things like that. But the Puritans would name their sons Elijah and Isaiah and things like that. They would dig up some of the Old Testament names, and that was curious. But the names that really made the Puritans stand out showed their fixation on, I don't know, didactic commands in their folkways, and also some strange practices of divination, you might say. There are a great many examples in the literature of Puritans wondering what they should do at an important moment in their lives and flipping open the Bible to a random page and sticking their finger on something, and that contains the answer to the question they're asking. So there are many Puritans that actually decide to go from England to Massachusetts by interpreting a Bible passage in such a manner. So they just flip open a random page and put their finger down. Well, evidently, a number of them did that with their children's names as well. So there was a child named Notwithstanding, for instance. There's a Puritan named Praise God. One famously, infamously named, If Christ had not died for thy sins, thou wouldst been damned. That was his given name. Another was named Maybe, a bizarre choice for a name, probably from sticking your finger into a Bible and just and going with whatever it landed on. One was named Kill Sin. One was named Die Well. One was named Flee Fornication. William Brewster, the man that helped settle the Plymouth colony on the Mayflower, he named one of his sons Love. It's a bizarre name for a man. His other son was named Wrestling, and I don't know why. This seems very strange to me as well. But you get the picture that these people are experimenting with radically new folkways. They are seeing themselves very differently. Just for the sake of for the fun of it, there was another child, What God Will. One was named Humiliation. One was named Sorry for Sin. One was named Job Raked Out of the Ashes. One was named Mene Tekel a Parson. So,
which I believe that's a reference to the book of Daniel, correct?
it is. Yes, that's what was written on the wall at Belshazzar's feast. God has found you wanting. Very peculiar. Okay, so they also experimented with new kinds of laws and punishments, and some of these are celebrated in literature. For instance, people who were caught in various sins were brought in front of the church congregation, presumably if they were willing to cooperate with church discipline. But they had a practice of public confession of sins. Now, this seems incredibly mortifying to us, even those of us who do practice the sacrament of confession. The idea that you would be called out in front of everyone and expected to answer for that in front of your entire community. They did do that, and they would put signs around people's necks. What you see in Nathaniel Hawthorne was practiced. And this was done for children as well as for adults. So there are examples, for instance, of children wearing signs around their necks. A young child was labeled with a sign that says, "He bites." Now, depending on the child, it might do some good, it might not. Another was given a sign that said, "Liar." Um, Interesting one, a woman that was caught in adultery, not unlike what we see with the Scarlet Letter. She was given a sign to wear around her neck, and the sign said, "For my bawdish carriage." So she carried herself like a bawd, like a prostitute. So she wore a sign around her neck saying, "I've been acting like a prostitute." And that was part of her punishment. Other interesting laws. The Puritans were very interested in enforcing laws on the Sabbath. They wanted everyone to observe the Sabbath, so people would be cited for recreating on Sunday, um, especially playing sports. Another thing that was done was women were policed for use of finery. Um, Women that wanted to dress in the fashion of the day, or who wanted to wear makeup. These were things that some Puritan communities tried to police and limit. So interesting things, sumptuary laws, um, all of those are curious. Now that feeds into the practice of the religion itself. What was Puritan religion like? They did not like symbols, and this is something very important about the English Civil War. You see the wholesale destruction of religious art all around England. Wherever Cromwell's Roundheads are victorious, they do things like smash out stained glass windows and destroy statuary and tear down rood screens and things like that. The Puritans did not like symbolism. They did not build their churches in the shape of a cross, even. They did not put up any artwork in their churches. They did not even like the shape of the cross. Now, the separatists are even more radical on that line. And you see the separatists attacking the religious symbols, like even simple symbols like a cross or a prayer book. They attack those things in the hands of their Anglican uh, their Anglican people that live in their community there at Plymouth. They do not like these things in their community, and they're not very restrained about it. Well, the Puritans are a little more tolerant than the Separatists. The Separatists are very radical, but they build these strange churches. You can look up one of them. The oldest church in Massachusetts is called the Old Ship Church, and it's on the coast of Massachusetts, south of Boston and Quincy. I forget the name of the town that it's in, but it's this big rectangular church. Instead of artwork inside, religious artwork, like you would find in many other churches, they would paint a great eye on the pulpit. The pulpit would also be in the center of the church building. Unlike many other churches where the main thing in the church is not the homily, it's not the sermon, it's the ritual that's the center. To take a common example, think of a Catholic Mass. The main point of the Catholic Mass is the Eucharist. It's the ritual that takes place at the altar, where the priest traditionally is faced away from the congregation, saying prayers that aren't really secret. Like, you can find out what these prayers are, but these prayers are not addressed to the congregation. They're addressed to God. And he sanctifies the elements and then distributes them. And that's the point of the service. A Catholic Mass might not even have a sermon. The point of the attendance of the service is the ritual itself. Because theologically, the understanding is it's the ritual that saves us. It's the ritual that we go for when we go to church. And it does us good to participate. The Puritans are coming at it from an intellectual angle. So they put the pulpit front and center, and they have an eye painted on the pulpit. And the idea is that pay attention, we're watching, that everyone pays attention, and they deliver their famous sermons. So the sermons are all exposition on scripture, and this can go on for hours. The prayers are also not liturgical prayers, which are consistent and, and everyone's saying the same prayer, is the idea. If you go to a liturgical church, the idea is that everyone is united in the prayers they pray. We all believe the same thing. We're doing the same things. In a Puritan church, the emphasis was on extemporaneous prayers, and the pastors were celebrated for their literacy and invention I think this is all perfectly reasonable and just, because this was great creative work. This is the great literature of early New England. It's their sermons and prayers. It's the work of the clergy. But they would go to church where the building itself is stripped of all ornament or symbolism. Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote about this. She said there was no ritual or drapery on anything in a Puritan service. And the sermons would go on for many hours. So this was a extremely intellectual enterprise. So the Puritans highly valued literacy and analysis. And I think that in retrospect, we can recognize something about the end game of that emphasis. It's a good thing to read the scripture and analyze what it means. I totally believe in that. But severed from a healthy relation to one's tradition, and the effort put into analysis to discredit the tradition, to discredit what their ancestors in England had been doing since they had been Christians, basically proving they weren't really Christians, that was all evil Roman Catholic corruption or something. That has interesting results. I think that that's ultimately the freedom to criticize like this is ultimately a self-defeating sort of practice. And you and I spoke about this right before we came on the stream together. The curious fact that demographically, the white English Puritans of Massachusetts are no longer distinct as a group. They all seem to have gone.
Well, and you see it in their places of worship as well. You know, I spent some time in Massachusetts about a year ago, and it was interesting, you know, going around these kind of picturesque towns, and one, no one lives there, right? They're sort of museum towns, but you go to these beautiful churches, and either, you know, no one goes to worship there. You know, they've been converted into libraries or apartment buildings or, you know, storefronts, or, you know, they have, you know, octogenarian, you know, congregations of two or three, you know, headed up by, you know, a not quite as aged divorced lesbian priest with a hyphenated last name, right? It's
Oh
like
my.
that culture is dead. I mean, to the point that, right, a lot of the kind of anti-Christian bait you see on the internet of like, oh, you know, your religion is fake because I found a, you know, a gay priest or something. It's like, well, you know, so many of those are from, you know, this area of the country. And, you know, it's interesting in our one of our earlier conversations about the Second Great Awakening, you know, the time at which religion was really burned out of this area, it really has never come back. You know, it's compared to the rest of the country relatively unchurched. And
Yeah.
obviously, you know, it's difficult to make, you know, sweeping generalizations about all of New England. You know, before we went live, we were kind of comparing and contrasting, you know, the differences between that area of the country. But nonetheless, like that kind of upper class progressive culture is really dead. You know, like sure that still exists, but it is nowhere near the dominant culture in that area. You know, it's been supplanted by, you know, white ethnics or Irish Catholics or, you know, any number of other cultures, and really it only exists in kind of a museum setting.
Yeah, it's a really extraordinary thing about it. I have not spent much time up there, but the impression that I've gotten is that the old wasps are mostly gone. And I really want to seek them out when I'm there, but when I do find them, they seem entirely secular. And that's the legacy of the Congregational Church, which is what the Puritan Church becomes, and the Unitarians, which many of those Congregationalists become, even by the time of the early Republic, the New England Blue Bloods are turning Unitarian. And if there's anything you can say about it, it is a sterilizing influence. And that's I think it's all the proof that's needed for a social dead end as a folkway. Something that's just as a point, an aside here, something that I find truly remarkable is that, as Henry Adams said, the Civil War was the conquest of America by Massachusetts. A funny quip, but I think it's accurate enough. We capture something about what was going on then by that quip. But even though Massachusetts uh, dominates in so many ways, they don't sustain it. They get replaced. And you go to New England these days, and when I go to Boston, I'm just overwhelmed by the fact that the place is full of Catholic churches, and the Puritans defined themselves more or less by their anti-Catholicism. So it's as if they're all gone now. They did not sustain themselves as a distinct group in America today. Whereas you can go around the United States today and find groups of people. Like it's very easy to go to Louisiana, for instance, and find Cajuns, or to find Louisiana Anglos like myself. We're still there in large numbers. We haven't been displaced, and we've had a continuity there. And I'm sure that that exists in New England as well. I want to seek it out. I want to find it. I think that you're more likely to find continuity in a tradition that has more to sustain it, like a belief that's not fundamentally revolutionary and analytical. um, Roman Catholics in New England, for instance, seem to have an abundance to build on. They've been there for a long time now. They've been there, many of them, from before the Civil War. So I think that's a curious thing. But back to my notes on New England religion. Part of the revolutionary character of Puritan worship was they threw out what had been learned about music. So they did not have musical notation. They got rid of musical notation. And this was part of their revolutionary approach to the practice of their faith. But that does not mean that they stopped singing. They still had hymns, but according to Harriet Beecher Stowe, once again, she said, everyone sang as best pleased himself. So they said that this was rote singing. Everyone had a habit of singing, but this meant that it was a cacophony. No one was singing the same notes. And I think that this matches with other things in their tradition. Like everyone has a different experience, and these are all vital to them. These are religiously extremely important to them. And then everyone sings a different note when it's time to sing. But this amazes outsiders. They say that this creates a terrible noise, and there's nothing like it. People that grow up with it have a kind of fondness for it as a thing peculiar to that group, right? But outsiders can't get around how anarchic it all is. They tried to do away with various ritual practices that they were accustomed to in England. Initially, they didn't want anyone to bow their heads or close their eyes, as is normal for many Christians. They didn't want anyone to bow or kneel on any occasion, but they did develop their very own traditions. They had these rituals of public humiliation and castigation, like I said, and that is an example that human beings fall into patterns of behavior. Even if we reject everything that came before us, even if we take a very revolutionary attitude, we still fall into patterns of behavior. We still want to brush our teeth every night, right? We still get into, a pattern. Oh, this is where I take off my shoes. I put my shoes over here. I keep my wallet and keys over there. You know, we have these very comfortable things that we do, and we do them over and over and over again. And we develop a pattern of behavior and a regular lifestyle. And the Puritans were very regular people, but they wanted to reinvent their society, but they fall into their own patterns of behavior. So I think that that's a curious thing. The Puritans have a strange tradition of foodstuffs. They like to eat beans and peas, and that's a good thing for them because those are very healthy foods, and they grow very easily in Massachusetts, and they eat lots of these things. They make what they call peas porridge out of them. This becomes what's called the canonical dish of New England. So they make a porridge out of peas or beans. They make a brown bread to go with it. They will scoop their beans with the bread. They like to eat it cold and without any seasoning or salt, because those are viewed as unnecessary encouragements of the passions. The Puritans have a real horror of bodily wants and desires. Not to say that they don't recognize their legitimacy. They need to eat to survive, but they want to purify their spirits by denying their bodies tasty things to eat. One Puritan reverend, he wrote of the bodily appetite, that's the appetite for food, as a source of spiritual danger. Another Puritan wrote about eating as it was preferable to think of eating as feeding. So he kind of brutalizes the idea, saying, well, this is what we have in common with animals, and so we do not want to invest in it. That's a curious way to look at it. So they were very famous for eating very plain foods. Another example of the sorts of things that they ate was the New England boiled dinner. So they would take some meat, and they would take some cabbage, and they would take some peas or whatever else they might have, and they would toss them into boiling water and boil them away into a kind of porridge, and eat that all waterlogged with no seasonings. Now, what they did have, it seems to me, a redeeming factor of all of this, they drank plenty of dark English beer, and they developed a tradition of making cider. And so they drank large amounts of cider as well. Now, as surprisingly, with such plain fare, it was still very nutritious. So you couldn't knock it for its nutrition value. They were getting a lot of good protein and vitamins out of this. But it's really amazing to us to look at the panoply of foodstuffs that are there in colonial New England, and see that the Puritans rejected everything in front of them. They did not like hunting for wild fowl. There was a tremendous amount of venison. They did not want to eat venison. They wanted to eat mutton and beef, just like they did back in England. They just don't want to roast it or season it. There's a tremendous amount of shellfish on the coasts of New England. They were not eating any of it, nor were they eating lobster. they found huge lobsters when they first arrived in New England. Evidently, lobsters just keep growing. If you let them live, they get bigger and bigger. But they weren't. They were not gourmands. They did not experiment with eating these things. These things were all foreign to them, and they did not. They were not adventurous with their food. Um, one thing that they did leave us was they loved baking in ovens. So they made lots of bread, the brown bread that I mentioned previously, but they also liked making pies. And that's one element of Puritan folkways that's still with us, as American as apple pie being a very Puritan dish. Let's see here. I'm gonna start wrapping this up. I want to mention Puritan accents. I mentioned before the names that they gave their children, but I'm gonna read a bit here out of David Hackett Fisher on the Massachusetts accent, which was very distinctive. The Puritans mostly came from the, let's see, northeast of London in an area called Norwich. That's where an awful lot of them came from. And they brought with them their regional accent, which dominated in Massachusetts. And I don't know what its status is these days. Let's see. It was described as a nasal twang. And New Englanders, it omitted the H after a W so that whale became whale. And they added an extra E before the OU so that now became a nasal meow. Soft vowels became hard and metallic. Uh, so glare was pronounced glar. Hair was pronounced har. Air was R. And war rhymed with star. So war becomes war. Interesting things. Hev for have. Yesterday for yesterday. General for general. Darter for daughter. Drowned for drown. America for America. So they add some R sounds at the ends of their words. These are all very interesting things. Let's see here. Furrer for furrow. Get or geet for get. Gret for great. Gal for girl. Gut for got. A gump is a foolish fellow. Gum is to impose upon someone. Head for had. Housen for houses. Het for heated. Hole for whole. Lots of very interesting aspects to their dialect there. But to emphasize, finally, these were all aspects of that accent from the region that so many of them came from. And we'll see when we investigate other folkways elsewhere in America, these regional characteristics are the rule for all of them. They all bring regional characteristics, even ways of dressing and saying things from the part of England that they came from originally. So that's the story of the Massachusetts folkways. As we know, the settlers of Massachusetts, the Puritans, they get along well enough with the separatists. It's a very curious thing that the king, King Charles, who the Puritans do not like and eventually behead, King Charles is interested in putting the Puritans in proximity to the separatists in Plymouth because the Puritans are the only group that has correspondence and relations with those separatists. So there's a certain wisdom in that choice. And the colonies finally unite um, into the colony of Massachusetts before independence. I forget exactly when that happens, but those two little colonies do unite. But the story of New England is one of religious schisms with political consequences. So I don't intend to get into the details of those things here, but the story of Connecticut is the story of a major disagreement between Puritan groups that results in one of them going to New Haven on the Connecticut coast and getting its own royal charter from the king. And that was the birth of the colony of Connecticut. And of course, the most famous of all of those splits is the split of Rhode Island. So the famous founding father of Rhode Island, Roger Williams, was a factional extremist in Boston. He started out as a Puritan minister, and he ended up going down some radical paths and denouncing and excommunicating everyone in authority in Boston until he finally started calling out the rulers of Boston themselves, including the royal governor, and denouncing them as all being heretical and in serious error, and they need to come and confess their sins to him and be made right with God. And they saw this eventually as very disturbing to public order, and they demanded that he cease and desist, and he refused to, and so they expelled him. And this was a very unreasonable man, Williams. He was he goes down to what is now Rhode Island in the wintertime and is taken in by the Indians there, who keep him alive under these circumstances. And later on, he embraces a form of the Baptist denomination. And formally, the way he got in trouble in Massachusetts was he was excluding everyone, saying no one is up to my standard. And in the end, he's the sole member of his own congregation, a congregation of his own invention. And but by the time he gets down to Rhode Island, he's embraced a radically different idea. And he says, well, who am I to judge what anyone does? And he becomes extremely accepting. And this makes Rhode Island a haven of rogues and radicals of all stripes, because Williams anyway, who's running the colony, he will tolerate basically anything, except Roman Catholics, of course. But
Well,
it's
I mean,
a
we can
curious.
hardly blame him for that, of course.
I understand that the Roman Catholics have a strong presence there in Rhode Island these days, but they were able to maintain their faith, and for all of their incredible characteristics, they are a very distinctive American grouping, a highly influential group, arguably the most important group that settles in the United States. The Puritans no longer exist as a religious group or possibly as a distinctive ethnic group. It's kind of funny to joke about the demographics and the ethnic makeup of the Mormons in Utah. I like to say that the white people of Vermont are the last of these Puritan wasps that did not convert to Mormonism and go west. So Vermont may be a last refuge of this sort. They still do exist among us in things that they believe. It's like a political tendency. to be a Puritan is to say something about one's politics these days. And I think that is still a meaningful phrase. I like how H.L. Mencken had it. The Puritan is someone who believes that someone somewhere is having fun, and must must be put a stop to. We must stop that from happening. That seems to me to be a an aspect of Puritanism that is still with us. It is still distinctive in our ruling class, I think. We saw the Puritans come out in force during the late unpleasantness with the exotic Chinese disease.
Well, and that's a point that Moldbug makes, right? Is that the Puritans took their same ideas about being on the city on the hill, excuse me, and sort of removed the Christ out of it, and kept those same inclinations and just turned it into sort of an earthly kingdom, if you will. And I think that there's probably a good bit of truth in that analysis.
Yeah, I think it is. I've gotten a lot of good ideas out of reading Moldbug on the Puritans. And one of the takeaway points I think that we could all take out of this is that the Puritans have a very unique take on their English heritage. And I think that it is a bad take. I think that it needs to be recognized as a very radical take that ultimately dooms them as a group. It is not a fruitful take. And the analysis and criticism that they put their own heritage to eventually discredits their own heritage, what they tried to build, and the rituals that they establish and create in New England. Which is why when we go to New England today, we have the sense that we are walking through a museum of a civilization that's long gone. And for better or worse, I think it is obviously for better because it's a more constructive civilization. When you go to the South, you can still encounter plenty of Southerners. And I think that one of the keys there is that the civilization was more organic. It did not have a revolutionary heritage built into it, in spite of what Moldbug says. Moldbug tries to paint all Americans that way. I take his point. Like I said, I'm quite indebted to him for a number of points, and I think he's rather good on the Puritans. But to try to read all Americans that way is to overlook that regional difference that is so vital in understanding American history.
So, George, we are fast approaching time. If people want to find more of your work, what's a good way for them to do that?
Yes, I've got a YouTube channel. If you look up George Bagby, you can find me reading a number of different things. It's mostly just an audio channel. I also have books for sale. I run Tall Men Books, and if you would like more information about that, my Twitter handle is the best place to search for it. Look for at Tall Men Books on Twitter. That's Tall Men. Men is plural. Tall Men Books. And you can find all of my books linked to a profile pin. I've made them all for sale and available there. So if you look at my profile, you'll see all my books pinned to my profile.
Well, again, George, thank you so much for coming out. This was a great episode, and I'm very pleased to speak with you again.
Thank you very much. It was great to be back.
As far as my stuff, you can find The Jay Burden Show on Apple, Spotify, YouTube. You can check out our sponsor, Axios Remote Fitness and Coaching. Again, guys, thank you so much for bearing with me while I've been waiting to get my new intro set up. I really do despise YouTube's copyright AI, but I cannot appeal it. Again, thank you all so much for coming out. And remember, keep your head out. The light can't last forever. Good night.